All right. Hello, everybody. Hello to you who is interested in learning more about self as context within the ACT model. And even if you're not interested in knowing anything about the ACT model, this is helpful for figuring out how to get into your observer mind, which is like the utmost goal of psychological flexibility in healing, and learning how to look at your thoughts from an analytical point of view. So when we think about the acceptance and commitment therapy model, we think about that Hexaflex, right? And so you can see in my post, you can see in a whole bunch of my stories that Hexaflex there, and it has those 6 pillars. And the ones that gets the most confusion and is the least straightforward is self as context. So let's figure out what that even means. And to do that, I'm going to kind of use a metaphor. But there's some other words that we use for self as context, like the observer self, sometimes the higher self. Sometimes it can be like whatever you need to use to get into the point of being able to realize that you are not your thoughts and you are not your feelings. You think your thoughts and you think your feelings. A lot of the times I use this like my hand as my observer self to be able to get into the mindset of being able to observe the person making the choices or what would lead to that feeling or that thought being the most like correct for you, right? Because our brains are thinking machines, which is what they're supposed to do. They link everything up in 100 bazillion different ways, and that's its job. It's supposed to do that because it keeps you safe, right? It helps you to be able to access a safe environment by being a constant evaluating and thinking machine. So, of course, it's going to think, it's going to relate, it's going to bring things together. And the observer self is the part of you that can see that happening in real time. Okay, so it's the part of you that goes, gosh, I'm upset right now. What made me upset? Rather than the part of you that's getting fused or hooked by this thought or this feeling that occurred with your thinking machine brain that is linking things up and trying to keep you safe. So it's the way that you can evaluate, is this true? Is this helpful in service of my values and my goals, right? And so it dovetails into the other parts because there's acceptance for that process, which is tricky because it's a part of the same thing, although it is a separate component. So it gets mixed up into self as context, and we can see acceptance a little bit easier because it makes a little bit more tangible sense. And then there's cognitive diffusion, which also kind of makes sense, right? Like being fused to a thought, being fused to a feeling, and then being able to separate from it in service of committed action, in service of our values, right? And so that all flows together. But the self as context component is being able to access that observing mind and being able to analyze the thoughts, feelings, and actions for the rest of the components. It's probably the most important, well, none of them are more important than the other. They are all in equal balance. But that's also why the Hexaflex model is really cool and a little confusing, especially if you're a behavior analyst, because there's no correct order of operations. You can bounce around that whole Hexaflex and in between and back and forth all the time, which is what makes getting into like identifying self as context confusing for you, because it just hops around a lot. And so I think it would be really interesting if any of you who are live with me right now have any questions around self as context, or maybe an example that might help with some clarification. I'll give one of my own examples, just to get things moving. But if you have one, I'm very happy to help you figure out how to identify the self as context within that. So for me, there's a lot of things that we are fused with that we don't notice. For me, I have struggled with eating disorder for a really long time in my life, and I'm still constantly amazed at the things that I'm fused with, to be able to notice, to be able to move forward on. And so for me, I noticed, which is the observer self, that I was constantly letting go of opportunities for beverages. Okay, so I had this rule that I only drank water, and water was what was healthy for me, and I laid down that rule probably in my teens or maybe after college, where I am just going to drink water because that's the best beverage for me. Now, as I've been working on my intuitive eating and intuitive movement and healing that eating disorder, I noticed that I was still fused with the idea that I was only drinking water. I was out, with, this is probably like a year ago. I'm still kind of working on it, with people more than a year ago. And we were getting, beverages, and they were ordering really yummy juice at brunch. And I was like, I'll have water. But then I was like, I actually really want to have that juice. In my observer mind, I think juice sounds really good. Why do I always not pick juice? And then kind of thinking like, well, does that align with my values now? No, I'm an intuitive eater, and I can eat what I want, and I can sample that, and I can be like a scientist, and I can choose if I like the juice. I can choose to stop drinking the juice. I can make all these choices. I don't have to rule out the juice, right? And so having all of that thought that I just said, right, was in observance of the feeling or the thought or the action that was automatically happening, right? Like I was automatically saying, nope, I'll have water. Nope, I don't want the juice, right? But I was able to get into that observer thought process. None of that happened out loud, and it probably happened really fast, where I said, wow, I've laid down this rule in my brain that isn't serving me. I'm evaluating that. Now that I've observed it, I can step into the cognitive diffusion. I saw that the fusion was happening, and now I can start defusing from that belief that this is the way that I act, and this is the way that I believe, and this is the way I feel about juice. And then I can start tapping into my values, and then I can start accepting that this might be uncomfortable, and then I can start tapping into committed action, right? And it all kind of started with noticing. And so noticing is the word that I use the most often when I start working with someone towards creating change, is when you're going about your day and you're doing stuff and you notice that, oh, this is an automatic response that I have and that I do, that's part of my daily life, but is that helpful? Is that true? Is that moving me toward my ideal future? And sometimes that happens in a reflective moment. Sometimes that happens in the moment. And that's actually really exciting and really cool, because then you get to like pivot and switch right then and there, and then collect, data around that. Is that what I want? Was that helpful? And then if it wasn't helpful, right, like maybe I tried that juice and I didn't actually like it. That doesn't mean that I'm never going to try more juice, right? It doesn't mean that that rule stands. It means like, oh, well, this iteration of this example of trying it out wasn't dope for me. It wasn't amazing. But what if I got curious about the juice? What if I tried other kinds of juice, right? And this is kind of an irrelevant example for maybe most people. For me, it was kind of profound, because that's just part of my like eating journey and healing my own eating disorder. But I hope that you can see some of the applications beyond that. Oh, I see a question here. So a friend makes a snarky comment, inconsiderate comment, but she is not her comments or even her thoughts and her feelings as a result of those comments. Not really the self as context, but an example of how others are also context and how we change our response to their actions. So thank you so much, Shredded with Sophia, for adding this one in. I'm so excited to look at this. So yeah, she made an option. She took the choice to make a snarky comment, and she was kind of probably hooked by that situation where it happened, and like it was the first thing that came into her mind, and she did it. And if she wasn't in her observer self, like there's a bazillion reasons why people make snarky comments. It could be because they think it's funny. It could be a way that they cope with something uncomfortable. It could be a habit. that's shaped up from some interaction in her life that made that the appropriate way to respond. I know that in my family, I actually had to do that, where I had to take away some of my snark because it wasn't actually aligned with who I wanted to be, but it was the way that my family interacted. So for her, right, she might have to do something like that I just described for myself, but as her friend, you also get to be an active participant and being able to observe your thoughts around the snarky comment. Now, sometimes what can happen is people might snap react. They might get defensive about the snarky comment and snark back, right? Or they might, whatever your response is. And then you get the opportunity to evaluate, is this helpful, right? Is this effective? Do I want to hang out with this person who's being snarky? Do I want to communicate with them? Like, there's something wrong in this situation. Usually that comes up as a trigger or a defensiveness. But when we lean into that, when we start being in our observer self of how our automatic responses are to this person's comment, we can evaluate what isn't working, right? So maybe it's that, like, I don't actually like hanging out with this snarky person. Maybe I'm hanging out with them because of habit, right? Maybe I really love this snarky person and I want to communicate to them that this comment doesn't make me feel good, but I don't know that I want to get into that because it's kind of scary, right? And so it's evaluating that, like, what's behind that? What things am I fused with that make this scary, that make that conversation not willing to have? It could be that you're afraid of losing that friend, or that you're afraid of conflict, or whatever it might be. And so when we get into our observer self and see what's going on there, right, we can make decisions, right? And we can't actually be in anyone else's head. We can't control what they do, but we can communicate what we want them to see. So in that example, we don't know the motivating operation. We don't know what's motivating your friend to make a snarky comment. We can look at the situation and you can communicate. But until they start tapping into their observer self to be able to see, like, what did this snarky comment do for me? Is it in service of my values? Sometimes it is. Sometimes being funny is. And if it doesn't land, we have to evaluate that. So I hope that answered your question. If you have more detail, please put it in the chat box here, or you can DM me and maybe we can start a convo about it. All right, let's see what this next one is. Question: can I help myself to get someone to that observing state, to see things or notice things, or notice that person's behavior? For example, my husband lost his job, I'm so sorry to hear that, a while ago, and he is very comfortable rolling throughout the life, even not wanting to work, because he knows wife will do and be responsible. So I started to wonder if it's me who takes too much responsibility and gives him easy life. So he, like a male, does not want to wish any more responsibility to develop and move on. So I think you kind of started working yourself through kind of what I was saying with the other example, is that, yeah, we can absolutely help someone get into that observer self. That's the majority of what I end up doing in my coaching. It takes different people different amounts of time to be able to have that click. And sometimes it does take the right motivator. And so for you, I think you did the exact thing that I would recommend, because we can't make anyone do anything, right? And as behavior analysts, that is such a painful thing, because we understand that we can change the environment to help create stuff, which absolutely that can make a big impact, but it's not always guaranteed, right? And even if we do, sometimes there's backfire stuff like that. And so in this situation with your husband, and not maybe wanting to work, what I would probably do is to get curious about what your needs are and what your needs within that relationship are, and probably open yourself up to some of the own fears around how you're in your observer self, right? So if you feel like some of the behaviors that you're doing, like you said, might make him feel safe and, not make him want to move forward, are perpetuating that being an option, then you might want to get curious about how you show up within that situation to be able to open up an opportunity for change, right? And that's going to be scary. That's going to be scary to do something different. And so being able to get into your observer self, kind of like I did with the juice, which is a way lower stress point probably, to be able to get into how can I observe the way that I am going to be making choices here? Is this helpful? Is this in service of my values? Is this true, right? And probably what will happen there when you get into that is that there's something your husband is afraid of. There's something that he's really upset about or scared in. And this kind of avoidance behavior is protecting him from the conversation or the scary thing. And it's the same for you. It's the same for everybody, right? Like we don't go into those things because we're trying to protect ourselves. And that's what our brain does, right? Like it goes into that fight, flight, or freeze. It links up all sorts of things. And it tries to protect us from uncomfortable thoughts and feelings like fear. And when we allow that to happen, we kind of create this bubble around us. But when we want to create growth, or when we have the right motivator, like a grumpy wife, we might be able, short-term negative reinforcement, long-term. Yeah, absolutely. That avoidance trap, that avoidance cycle. And it's happening with thoughts, right? And we're not even getting into actions, right? So what I would say is that being able to practice getting into yourself of context. Oh, great. Okay, it sounds like it's making sense. Practice getting into your space, your fears, so that you can have the conversation with him to help him start figuring out those fears of his. So it looks like we had, oh, great. Okay, so helpful to delve deeper. We can't control others' private events. We can't control others' actions either. But we can modify our responses, absolutely, based on the behaviors that we would like to reinforce. And like, I would always definitely recommend compassion here, because this is an uncomfortable process. It's uncomfortable for you, it's uncomfortable for them, and everybody deals with discomfort differently. And so inviting in compassion whenever we're dealing with any of this kind of stuff at any point in time, and noticing purposefully, intentionally, that we're going to work, add compassion to this process is super duper powerful as far as being able to get results, which is why I always recommend providers or clinicians who are going to be helping people with the ACT model get experience in it themselves. Being able to see yourself from that self as context, that observer self, and have the empathy for how transformative and painful and uncomfortable that process is to change the way that you view things, is going to allow you to help people on a completely different level than if you're like, oh, well, just do this, right? It's not that easy, and you know it, and when we know it. And so when we practice this ourselves, then we're going to have a completely different response. We're going to show up a completely different way for the people who we're working with. So true. It's huge to change the mindset that goes against everything that we're taught. That's so important, Shredded with Sophia, because as behavior analysts, we're definitely taught some things around mindset and mindfulness, and that it's not necessarily important. Now that needs to be changed, in my opinion, and I think we're the people who are going to do that, right? We're the people who are going to make the voice of the BACB, or for anyone who's not there, who's going to be a model for people in the future, to be able to make change around mindfulness and be able to talk about it as not a buzzword, as not just another thing that we add to our to-do list, but as a process that we use to create the lives that we want to live. And so to me, ACT is the way that we're going to transform behavior analysis. We got some really bad news today. Makes me want to cry just thinking about the kind of shock therapy stuff that's still being allowed. And it's going to be getting our people, right? Like the people who are making change and making progress and making the rules, right? To have psychological flexibility, because they're lacking psychological flexibility if we're not adopting ACT. Like they just don't get it. They don't understand it. But when they do have psychological flexibility, and we as like the group of people under like the union, I guess, of the BACB, when we start voicing that, when we start practicing it, then when we start doing it, then we're going to start taking those committed actions that are going to lead to change. And so the first step is just understanding self as context, being able to get into that observer self, start questioning how we work, the way that we work, and the way that we allow people to tell us how we're going to work, and start doing some of those uncomfortable things that lead to change on a bigger level. That's not only good for our clients, but for us as individuals, because I know a lot of us go into behavior analysis to help people and usually to help ourselves too, right? Because there's stuff that we struggle with. And when behavior analysis by itself didn't help me in my mental health stuff is when I moved to ACT. And that's when I found out that behavior analysis supplements ACT, and that ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, is the process for really sustainable, big, beautiful, life-changing transformations. Not that ABA isn't. It's just that for me, in all of the things that I've done, that is a supplement. And so I would definitely encourage you to dive in more. You can absolutely DM me if you want some more resources as far as who I recommend, or if you want to start like walking that path for yourself and you've got some goals that you want to work on. I have some coaching spots available. So it looks like we're all out of questions here, but my DMs are always open, and I'm always open to doing more chats, especially around this. This is my absolute passion, and I love sharing this information with anybody who will listen. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that there, and I look forward to chatting next time. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.